Ooh, and we're being recorded. Nice. So, as Natalie mentioned, my name is Karen Lacy. I am a coordinator for the California Archaeology Site Stewardship Program, and I'm also an adjunct through the San Diego Community College District, and I'm also a business owner with Muse Curatorial Consulting Group. And I had one quick little announcement for a little other project that I'm part of, and that's the Gaslamp Quarter Historical Foundation has their Fallback Festival this weekend. It's virtual, and they have a scavenger hunt app, so check it out because it's a scavenger hunt you could do at home, or you can go to the San Diego Gaslamp to do it. So, little shameless plug there. And another quick announcement, please save the questions till the end, just because it's a little difficult for us to look at the chat at the same time that we're giving the lecture, but we're happy to answer any questions to the best of our ability. So, Sandra?
Hello, I'm leaning over the table. As you can see, we are responsibly socially distancing here. My name is Sandra Pentney, and I am the Director of Cultural Resources for Chambers Group. I'm an archaeologist with about 20 years of experience. And I just want to say before we jump into this, we have a lot of people who possibly aren't part of our regular SDCAS group, and I wanted to alert these new people that this is not intended to be a hard research. These are fun talks that Karen and I put together. It's not primary research. We spend a lot of time reading other works. So if what you're looking for is a hard bioanthropological or archaeological treatise on epidemics, this is not going to happen tonight. I am sorry. We are looking into some of the more colloquially interesting facts about epidemic archaeology, and with that, we will get into it.
Yeah. Okay, and a quick disclaimer. Hold on, there we go. Go ahead.
Quick disclaimer, this presentation, we do have photographs of human remains. We try very hard to make sure that they are done tastefully, and all of the photos that we are using and graphics that we are using come from the internet, and we have sources available for anyone who would like to check them out. You can reach out to us afterwards.
Yeah. All right, so we want to kind of start where we got the idea from, because mainly this is a personal story for me. We chose this topic really in large part because of the coronavirus and some personal connections when we have these conversations that are brought up, in regards to my family in particular. I had a great-grandfather whose picture you can see here. His name was John, and he actually passed away because of the 1919 influenza epidemic. And it's kind of become part of our family lore, the fact that he decided to socially distance from his family and went to a hotel. And this particular hotel was actually a bathhouse that many people went to try to feel better. And he may or may not have known that he had influenza specifically, but he knew that he was sick. And I have, one of the pictures I have here is an envelope, and this was the last letter that he was known to have written. And basically, he wrote it to my great aunt, talking to her about, happy birthday, and be a good girl, and help out your mom. And so when the coronavirus kind of started, it brought up a lot of these conversations with my family, and, we found, this letter, and a lot of newspaper clippings about him and what happened. And so that's kind of where this is partially born out of for me and as Sandra.
So some of you may be wondering what archaeology could offer to the study of diseases. Quite a bit, actually. Archaeology is very detail-oriented and draws on a lot of side disciplines to provide context on the environment that led to archaeological deposits being left in the ground. So when epidemiologists want to study ancient diseases and the evolution of diseases, archaeological data can be really quite invaluable to them. We look at vertebrate and invertebrate zooarchaeology to investigate possible disease hosts or vectors, and we'll discuss that a little bit later, specifically with reference to the bubonic plague. Archaeobotany, geoarchaeology, and paleoecology are all used to reconstruct climatic conditions during plague epidemics and the impact that the current climate of the time, what impact that may have had on disease hosts, disease vectors, and how people respond to disease. Urban archaeology is often used to establish environmental conditions and their impact on the disease biology and transmission, such as housing conditions, population density, town size, water supply, transportation, food supply, and general facilities. The material culture, burial archaeology, and archaeological dating are often used to ascertain the dates of burial sites through radiocarbon dating or other relative dating by the presence of chronologically diagnostic artifacts. And bioarchaeology and paleopathology are often used to analyze the physical remains of victims and help determine if there are skeletal markers left over by the cause of their death. Certain diseases can leave some very distinctive marks on people's bones. So we started out trying to find when epidemics really became a thing and why. Had they been around just throughout all recorded history? And there is no definitive answer. I kind of expected that result, but we did find some very distinctive influences that help people's susceptibility to epidemics and different illnesses. We don't see a lot of evidence of major epidemics happening in the prehistoric. Now, some of you may be saying, well, yeah, but there's no written records for the prehistoric, and you are correct. However, we do have a lot of material culture from those times, both in the New World and in the Old World, and can make quite a bit of inferences, and we'll show you some good examples of that in the coming slides. So in the prehistoric, people lived a hunting and gathering lifestyle. They lived in small groups. They moved frequently. And what this type of settlement pattern provides is really a safety net against epidemics. Of course, people still got sick, but not to the same extent and not with the same illnesses as mass urbanization causes. Hunters and gatherers have a much more varied diet than agricultural societies. And also with moving constantly every few months or once a year or two, they are able to get rid of their waste. They move on to a different area and move out of the mess that they leave behind. So they had better or more varied nutrition. They had the moving not only reduce the waste, but also therefore reduces rodents and other vector type animals that could be harboring epidemics or nasty bugs with them that we see later on. And really, it isn't until we have major agrarian settlements that we start to see epidemics being noted. And they think that there's two main reasons here. The first one is that people's diets became much more limited and dominated by the crops that they were growing. Also, people lived in larger groups. They were sedentary, so human waste piles up and doesn't get diluted in the environment and can create hazardous conditions. And also, in agrarian societies, people live much more closely with livestock and other animals, so there's a much bigger a chance for vectors to transfer from animals to humans. So we wanted to do a bit of a timeline of epidemics, but really there are too many of them to have a good slide. So this one has about maybe 10% of the epidemics that we found going through the history books. And you can see back to the one that's kind of cut off at the back is the Black Death. That was the major bubonic plague epidemic from the 1300s. And moving forward towards this in timeline on the right there. On the left, you can see the death tolls from each. And really, as we get more towards modern times, as you would expect, there are new diseases that come up, but we're able to control them much quicker, and generally they don't lead to as much of a death toll as the 200 million estimated deaths from the Black Death.
Given that there are so many, different diseases and illnesses to talk about, we really wanted to focus primarily on specifically the plague, both the pneumonic and the bubonic plague, and just because there's a preponderance of evidence in terms of the archaeological record, and there's also a lot of things that happened in regards to cultural change. So we wanted to really focus on talking about that, and then moving into some specific examples of cultural change and adaptation. That said, though, we did want to talk about the history of epidemics in general and the earliest evidence that we can see of some kind of epidemic that can be found. And this is going back to China, so it's 3000 BC, so basically over 5,000 years ago. This is a prehistoric village site. It's called Hemin Manga, and it has over 29 homes, as you can see on the picture on the left. And what really happened there is really interesting. Each one of these homes are about 200 square feet, and one of them has over 100 skeletons that seem to have been just kind of stacked inside, and then they burnt the hut just after. So because of the way that they were stacked and that there weren't skeletal remains in any of the other huts, shows that it was something that happened quickly. The victims that were found here are between 10 and 35 years old, so there's no children younger than that, and there's no one older than that. So it's really kind of what you would think of as like the healthy part of the population. And we did want to throw this out here, that there's also another prehistoric mass burial that's nearby in another part of northeastern China, and that's called Maozangu. Anyway, so this is kind of unknown in regards to what this illness is, except that it happened quickly and that the site was abandoned very quickly after in both of the specific sites that we're talking about in terms of this prehistoric village and these village areas.
So the oldest burials that we have been able to, pardon the pun, but dig up, that can be attributed to bubonic plague are this couple here. They were found in the Samara region of Russia, and they date to about 1800 BC. The bioanthropological studies done on their remains revealed that Within the bones, there was the plague vector, which is known as Yersinia pestis. That's the bacteria that causes the illness. So they are quite sure that this couple died from the plague. But there's only 2 of them. So we know that the plague was around for centuries in the prehistoric, possibly millennia, but it didn't reach epidemic proportions, other than those 2 examples in China that do not have Yersinia pestis in it. There are no other major mass burials. So the question becomes, people could still get the plague and die from it, but why didn't it become epidemic in proportion? We've discussed a couple of cultural adaptations that probably helped, but also they did find that the Yersinia pestis that came from these individuals has 1 less strand of DNA from the Yersinia pestis that is attributed to causing the Black Death and the other epidemics and pandemics of plague throughout the years. So the DNA, or the bacteria managed to evolve to be more robust and be easier transmitted and to live longer. So the Black Death started in 1347 with the siege of Kaffa. This is in the Middle East. The Mongols invaded. There's a great legend with this, actually, that the Mongols had realized that they couldn't possibly win the war, but were a vindictive bunch and decided that they would catapult bodies of people in their encampment that had died from the plague into the city over the walls. And that's what's depicted in this picture here. It's highly unlikely that that's actually what happened. It makes a great story, but realistically, it was probably the rats that were with them that caused got into the city and caused the spread of the plague virus. Now, somewhat unfortunately, the city was hosting fleets of Italian merchants, and when they saw that the city was coming under siege by the Mongols, they fled. Unfortunately, not quickly enough. They managed to take the plague with them. So on this map, you can see in the lower right-hand side is where the outbreak in 1347 is supposed to have started at the city of Kaffa, and it follows the trade routes chronologically. I can't see because the conference call thing is covering up my timeline, of course, but we have starting down in the south near Sicily is one of the earliest recordings, then moved into Sardinia, Corsica, and Marseille. And it followed, you can track this with the trade routes and people coming back. It's really quite extraordinary how tightly they've been able to put together this timeline of the spread of a disease that happened 700 years ago. And Karen will talk about some quarantine issues.
Right, so this is one of the earliest cultural adaptations that we can really see in regards to the plague, was the idea of quarantine. And that would be isolating individuals who were sick or who came in contact with people who were sick to try to stop the spread of the diseases or the illnesses. They didn't quite know, some of the mechanics of what was really going on, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But the idea of this idea of quarantine and the word quarantina means 40 days. And this was used and came from basically the 14th to 15th century Venetian language. Interestingly enough, what they were really doing was isolating the ships. So they would require the ships, if they came from basically the Middle East or kind of really far away, they would have to kind of hang out in the surrounding water and quarantine themselves for 40 days. Later on, what this map shows was other versions, as they kind of evolved from that, they ended up having quarantine islands. One of which is somewhere where the sailors would go, and another one is where families would go that came into contact with people who were showing signs for being sick. And I do want to just throw a random aside here, is that quarantine, the word did come from, this, time in Venice, but quarantine as a practice has a slightly earlier connotation, and that is actually from 706 to 707. There was, the first hospital was built in Damascus, and they would isolate those infected with leprosy from other patients in the hospital. So it's not quite quarantine in this way that we're talking about, but it's kind of almost a precursor to that. So we did want to just kind of throw that in there.
So the Black Death raged for many years, and then it went away. And so I wanted to look at what happened to the Black Death. It decimated the population. Over 200 million people died. Almost 50% of Europe was gone. This had huge cultural implications, as well as economic implications. But as to why the illness stopped spreading, nobody really knows. Some have suggested that simply modernization. We're starting to see more focus on stratified cultures and specialization in the very early beginnings of the medical industry happening, people turning and developing scientific practices. Again, very early stages of this. Also, I kind of wonder if critical mass was gone. There were so few people left that they were able to spread out more, and the plague vectors, the fleas and the lice and the rats, didn't have as easy of a target, and they weren't spreading it from person to person as easily anymore because they were more spread out.
Another one that's out there is maybe climatic changes. Sometimes illnesses would get really just a lot more prevalent and out there, specifically the plague, in times of warming, and that would have a direct result. So there might be something with that, and that could also go back to animals, or it could just go back to being able to live longer in terms of the germs and whatnot.
The one thing that we do know is that the plague did not go away. The illness either stopped spreading or subsided and wasn't as deadly, but Yersinia pestis was very much still around and shows up many more times throughout history. And one of the websites that I was researching was looking at how do you quantify when the end of an epidemic or an outbreak is, and it's really the best answer to that I have found is that it's not when the disease is actually vanquished, but it's when the end is declared, when people grow tired of being in panic mode all the time and learn to live with the disease and how to adapt their culture around it. So we are going to skip forward about 300 years and look at the Great Plague. We're focusing on London here because some recent excavations for the Crossrail project in London, this is a huge underground train network that the city is building for people commuting, and has had some really remarkable finds come up as they tunnel through. And one of the things that Karen touched on with her Chinese example from 5,000 years ago is being able to identify an abrupt change in cultural practices to identify that something drastic has happened. We see in a whole settlement from that Chinese village, burials stacked up, people stacked like cordwood inside a house and lit on fire. That's clearly not what they would normally do to preserve their dead. And the pictures that come out of this Crossrail project are really telling of that. What they're excavating here is the cemetery from Bedlam Mental Hospital. And you see in the far right picture, people are isolated. They have their own individual interments, and this is really representative of business as usual. This is normal. How even the downtrodden and people who are sick enough to be relegated to Bedlam were still given decent burials. Then you start seeing more and more people getting stacked together in the center picture, and it kind of culminates in the picture on the left. Right, if I recall correctly, there are over 15 individuals represented in that bone pile, and this is what they refer to as a plague pit. Yeah, that's a very popular term to throw around, and you're looking at a plague pit right there, and it's very distinctive. It is very different from contemporary burial practices, and it's easy to tell that something had drastically happened to make them just stack people on top of one another. They were running out of room.
And we did a presentation, I believe it was the one 2 years ago when we talked, or maybe it was last year, the one we did on asylums and things like that. And I did just want to throw out there that what's really interesting about the Bedlam archaeology is that it was founded much earlier than the plague. It was like 1200s. And so it shows archaeology of different kinds of patients that would have been interred there. So not just mental health, it would have been also like other kinds of things going on, maybe even potentially leprosy or something else. But it's this really quick burial that's really telling of what was happening during that time period.
So this is a truly amazing if you're an archaeologist or a history buff or geek like I am. This is a cross-section of what they were digging through to get to install the tunnels for the Crossrail project, and you can see the stratigraphic profile there, starting at the bottom with the Romans with their wonderful engineering. They're still finding preserved plank roads and building foundations in that strata. Then this part of London became quite marshy in times of climactic change, where it became much wetter. Then as it dried out, it became inhabited again, and that's when you start seeing Bedlam. This area is starting to be used very intensively at this point. And the city was growing up very rapidly. And then we move up again in depth, and we're getting to the Victorian times. And that's where most of the current sewers. So the other interesting thing is looking at just how deep this Crossrail tunnels are going. It's no wonder that they have found so many interesting archaeological finds.
So now we want to skip forward, just kind of talking about the plague itself and just letting you know that it is still out there. And one of the last major outbreaks of the plague in the U.S. in particular was actually not too far away. That was in Los Angeles in 1924. Now, it was actually a small group of people, 39 people in total became sick with this, and they were quarantined in, basically there were 15 homes that were quarantined, but there was also districts that were quarantined as well. So if you know anything about LA, some of this is now considered like the arts district. What was really interesting about this is that they were also kind of in this place of doing neighborhood upgrades, and they were already invested in doing like rodent killing sprees at the same time, and this really pushed it to a different level in that instead of just killing the rats that they were finding and burning the trash and things like that, they were now, for at least a period of time, testing the different animals that they were catching, in particular the rats, but they were also catching squirrels to see if any of them had the plague, because one of the first people to come down with the plague as part of this epidemic was someone who had killed a rat and talked about how he killed the rat, and then, oh, by the way, there's some stuff going on with the rat, and then he comes down with it, and then his daughter did too. And the way that this particular plague started was the neighbors were caring for these two people, the father and the daughter, and then the person who was caring for them had a boarding house, and it really just kind of spread out and radiated out from there. One of the other ways that they really kind of dealt with this, besides just quarantining the specific area, was that when they kind of decided that it was done, it took basically about 2 to 3 weeks in terms of this quarantine, so it was fairly short. People after that didn't really become sick with it, but they kept up with their rodent killing sprees and burning trash and things like that. But they also completely obliterated neighborhoods after this as well. This hit particularly hard a Latino, Latinx neighborhood, and you can see one of the pictures on the top is showing some of the more poor constructed homes, and then the destruction of basically tearing that down and burning many of those structures to the ground. Some of the ones that actually did remain, later they had their foundations were excavated because they actually remained and were re-inhabited for several more decades after. There's a great article that was written about this, and it's in the sources, but it kind of talks about, these neighborhoods, and some of the ones that were the most hit by the plague actually weren't that bad of shape in terms of the buildings themselves, and people lived in them right after, which I think is a little gruesome, but interesting that it happened. And today there are at least, on average, 5 to 7 people that can contract the plague by coming into contact with wild animals like squirrels, and mice and rats and things like that when they are basically in more rural areas. So it's still out here.
You see signs for it in a lot of areas up in the Tehachapi. I remember seeing signs to stay away from the squirrels because there were a lot of them carry plague. And I do actually want to mention, we've discussed rats and plague vectors quite a bit already. There isn't really any consensus that it was the rats themselves and the fleas on those rats that spread it. People had fleas too, and
body lice.
And body lice, and both of those are capable of carrying the Yersinia pestis bacteria. So, the poor rats may have gotten a bad rep all these centuries, and it was the dirty people that spread it. I'm not sure that one will ever be solved, but it's interesting to think about.
So we're already in the Americas, so we did want to just quickly touch base on some epidemics that happened. So we're jumping back just a tiny bit in time a little bit to really talk about some of the effects of international trade and colonialism in the New World in particular. So what's really interesting is that, there were a lot of diseases that were brought by Europeans to the New World, but there was also some diseases that kind of went back and forth, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But we did want to kind of just say that, in general, when you look at the archaeology, there were really no major diseases in the New World because of the economic and settlement practices were still largely hunting and gathering, but some tribes did practice horticulture and agriculture. They didn't really have livestock animals, though. So that's definitely a major difference. And people and diseases that were kind of around at that time, there was something called yaws, which is kind of the New World strain, and then there's also syphilis, which was in the Old World. We don't really want to get into that in this particular lecture, but that is definitely a contentious debate into which was introduced first and by who, and it honestly goes back and forth a lot. So let's start at 1492 and talk about Columbus and, what that really kicked off in regards to that initial first contact. And it's impossible to really quantify with any certainty the impact of that European contact on New World populations, but it is estimated that basically pre-contact populations was possibly from 8 to 30 million people. And between 1942 and 1650, the Native American population, in particular, may have declined as much as 90% as the result of many of these epidemic outbreaks that the different Europeans brought with them. And there's also maybe some crop failures and food shortages that were all a part of that, because, you know, if 90% of the population is gone, it kind of affects a lot of the trade networks and, you know, spending time with crops and things like that.
So this is depicting what's being taught in schools now as the Columbia Exchange, the movement of goods and diseases all over the world. You can see sugar, rice, and tea came in from Asia into Northern Africa and Europe, and they brought with them the plague. Cassava, manioc, and cacao was brought from South America into Africa. Malaria and yellow fever were transmitted from Africa over to South America, and it goes on and on. So clearly the exchange was not just goods. There was an awful lot of biological impact with regards to human health that was going back and forth too.
And that definitely would have affected the culture. As I mentioned, in 1942, that really kicked off a lot of those initial, early exchanges that would have wiped out a lot of the Native American populations throughout the Americas. But I wanted to skip ahead and talk about something that happened just before North America in particular was basically colonized. So when the Pilgrims first arrived, they landed at an abandoned village, and that is, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but Pawtuxet. And those inhabitants had died of a disease epidemic that basically ravaged a lot of New England, and that was from 1616 to 1618. And I have listed here on the timeline all the different tribes that would have affected. And the site where those first pilgrims landed was from the Wampanoag tribe specifically. And what's really interesting is in this area, this New England area, you have smallpox coming in from 1616 to 1618, wiping out a lot of the population, and this is a direct wave from the earlier epidemics that were first brought over. And then you have another one that came through almost around the same time of yellow fever, and this was focused a little bit more in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, also affecting the Wampanoag nation, and that affected about 2/3 of them. Basically, if they hadn't gotten wiped out from the smallpox, then they probably also got a double whammy of the yellow fever. Now, fast forward that to 1620. In 1621, you first have basically what we now think of as the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock. But an interesting kind of thing is that they're in this abandoned Wampanoag village, or in and around that, where they already had some spaces for like crops that were cleared and the, site for a village and things like that. And you have the Wampanoag people seeing, coming back kind of to this area after, these diseases and things like kind of really wiped them out. And they came back and they saw, these early settlers starving. And basically they helped them get through that first winter, which is really thought of as the basis of the story for the first American Thanksgiving.
Some current researchers are looking into much larger effects of the depopulation of the New World and its effect on people's health. This very busy graph is showing measurements from different ice sheets of carbon concentrations. And this researcher is trying to make the case that the mass die-off of Native Americans especially in the agricultural regions, spurred reforestation. As there's no one out tending the crops. People had died, people had moved on. There weren't enough people to keep the land clear, and so you have a massive influx of pioneering forest species and forests reestablishing themselves. And the speculation that that caused the Little Ice Age. So you can see on this graph, the Little Ice Age is the yellow vertical bar, and it starts when the carbon levels on the bottom line are at its lowest, and that happens to be at about 1500, right after Columbus has arrived in the New World and disease is spreading like wildfire. And then as the population starts to sort of level off in North America as more and more Europeans arrive and proliferate, that they are clearing more land again, that the amounts of atmospheric carbon dioxide was starting to rebound, and the temperatures of the Little Ice Age eventually in the 1700s mellow out.
So let's get local again. We're living in San Diego, and there's a lot of epidemics that have happened here specifically. And I wanted to kind of list a couple of them that we know about. We know that there was a smallpox epidemic in 1888, followed by influenza in 1918, 1919, which really hurt a lot of the population in North America and around the world. Random aside on that one is that even though that was called the Spanish flu, there's a possibility that the strain that affected everybody, maybe not that started the influenza epidemic, but the one that definitely kind of went around the globe, possibly started in Kansas at a military training camp. So a little interesting tidbit there. And then I want to talk, there's in 1957, we have the Asian flu, and then followed in the 60s by the Hong Kong flu. And then the last one is the H1N1 pandemic, which many of us will probably remember, and that was from 2009 to 2010. Another little aside there is that it may have had American roots. So the first confirmed case of the disease in the country was actually a 10-year-old boy, and that was someone that was identified in April 2009. So just to give a couple numbers, that's an estimated 60 million people in the United States were affected by that, but only 12,500 died. So that's just kind of something to kind of think about in terms of like some of these things maybe get named something, and it's not a reality in terms of where they originated. Like the Spanish flu actually possibly originated, at least the strain that affected everybody, in Kansas. So it should have been called the Kansonian flu, perhaps?
Or the American flu.
Or the American flu. All right, so moving along, San Diego specifically, and the flu, what I really like about this picture is that it shows that there was a lot of mask wearing at the time. And looking at the local newspapers, the term that I want to bring back, because I think it's funny, is mask slacker. So there were a number of arrests that were made and stores that were fined because they were allowing or people were not wearing their masks correctly. There are newspaper articles and advertisements showing people that they can buy masks, how to make masks, and even how to properly wear your mask. So it's really kind of an interesting little thing. And I also included another little cartoon that you can see here. It's called Flu, and it says that they improved the looks of some people, and that's regarding the masks, and that's called Funny Looking Us. And that's talking about, like, if you don't look that great, wear a mask and you look much better, which I think is kind of cute. So let's kind of get into some of the, basically the cultural change that really happened because of epidemics. And when we look at concepts in terms of medicine and how we care for people who are ill, that really weaves itself in the aspects of daily life, like, you know, choices that we make in regarding diet, the clothing that we wear, adornments that we have, and that's often directly linked to, you know, frameworks of, you know, religion and ritual. They can also be tied to status And there's some of them that are very culturally specific attitudes that we have towards food, body, and the Constitution, and things like that. And I also, one quick little aside on that last slide, we don't need to go back, but one of the things that happened in terms of culture change after the Great Mortality, which is the plague that happened in the 1300s in most of Europe, was that there was an increase in the construction of personal chapels and churches kind of throughout, basically we could say England and parts of Western Europe. It also affected the art and music of the era, and it really showed that people are flocking to the church. They need an answer for why this is happening, and so they're going to the church. What's really interesting, though, and this is kind of something that didn't really play itself out until much later, is that the church didn't have enough people because they were also hit hard. They were caring for the sick, their flock, and so they're getting sick as well and dying off. So what happened right after that, as a direct result of the plague coming through, the church ended up lowering their standards for training and basically allowing people in that maybe didn't have the same education level or even the same values and beliefs, which then possibly led to things like Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. So it's a loose tie, but it is a tie because many of the people that were hired during that period and also the people that they hired were a little bit more corrupt or lax with some of the strict rules that the church had had previous to that. So moving forward, some other things that we can kind of talk about in regards to culture change would be shaming for not wearing a mask or wearing a mask. And you can see that in some of the articles in regards to the 1918-1919 influenza epidemic. That's really where we're seeing masks being worn in terms of the way that we see them today, being worn a lot. There's also the plague mask, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that has was around in the past as a way that doctors and nurses were protecting themselves. But it's also kind of played itself into how we look at Halloween and haunted houses and things like that. Handkerchiefs are directly tied to TB. When TB kind of became more and more a thing that people were being affected by, there was a huge influx in handkerchiefs because they were tying that to things like germ theory and stuff like that. The last thing I will kind of save to the end in terms of fashion. So the evolution of the medical field is really important to understand when we place all of these cultural changes into context. When we look at some of the earliest written information in regards to the practices of taking care of people who were sick, there was definitely this supernatural, maybe magic kind of source for why people are sick. There's something going on. We're not maybe leaving enough of an offering, or we're not praying hard enough, whatever that might be. And then throughout the years, it was tied to blood or miasma, eventually germs and quarantine and vaccinations kind of became a thing. So I did want to touch base here in terms of blood. Sometimes bloodletting was a practice, and one of the ways you would do that is if you weren't feeling very well, you would place leeches on the body, and that would drain you of your miasma or your bad blood kind of thing. I also wanted to touch on practices in regards to hygiene. So in terms of religion, there are some rituals that deal with hand washing, and those have been around for thousands of years, particularly in the Islamic and Jewish cultures. But the notion of disease spreading by the hand was not something that was part of the medical system until basically the last 130 years. It's first recorded in regards to hand washing being tied to life-saving power. That was about 1848. And it was not something that was a welcome change, and so it ended up really not taking a hold. Basically, it was this man who's considered essentially the father of hand washing, and that's Agnes Semmelweis, if I'm saying that correctly. He is basically a doctor that worked at a hospital in Vienna, and he was, really looking at, different scientific approaches to medicine. Something that he kind of figured out was there was a lot of doctors at that time, you would practice on the cadavers in the morgue, just kind of like what happened to this patient, how can we do something differently, basically testing out ideas and theories on the body. But the problem with that is while they were working on the cadavers, they would then turn around and go up to, say, the maternity ward and deliver babies. And a lot of the babies and the mothers were dying of different kinds of fevers, and they just didn't understand why. So this guy, Agnes, made a tie saying, hey, maybe that childbed fever, that we are getting at, they don't really have that when it's specifically midwife-run clinics, but we have it at a hospital. That tie shouldn't be there. So he tried to start getting people to wash their hands as they went from the cadavers into the maternity ward. Interestingly enough, people were offended by that because they felt that, the doctors are of a higher class and they're not dirty. How dare you call them dirty? And so eventually he was essentially laughed out and spent his later years in an asylum.
One of the standards that I keep seeing come up in our research that's analogous to what we're going through now with the whole COVID quarantine and mask wearing is that how difficult it is to get people to protect themselves from anything. It's kind of a wonder we've made it this far as a species.
Well, hand washing has only been around for 130 years as one of those protective measures, right? So, talking about the medical field and how we combat disease, it's kind of interesting to really talk about vaccines in particular. So this is not a complete timeline or history of vaccines, but we did want to touch base on inoculation. I'm saying that completely wrong. But there are several accounts dating pretty far back to at least 1000 AD that China and parts of India practiced some kind of inoculation to smallpox. So they would take the scabs of someone who was sick, dry them, and inhale them. They would also sometimes maybe, basically grind them up and place them in the arm and even ingest them in other ways. And this was something that was done pretty early on in this part of the world. It's interesting, though, that when you come down to, Western medicine, that was not something that we really accepted at all until Edward Jenner in 1796. Now, he's also working on smallpox, perhaps hearing about basically what had been done in China to some success as well as in India in regards to the smallpox vaccination. And he noticed that basically a lot of the milkmaids that are working in direct contact with cows would have something called cowpox, but it wouldn't kill them. They would have it. They would have these little pox on their pustules basically on their hands and their arms for a period of time, and then they would get over it. So he decided to take that same pus and basically make a vaccine. So this is really the first kind of vaccine, and nobody believed him, but he tested it on his son first to show, hey, I believe in this so much that I'm going to use it on my son first. And then he proceeded to talk several of the families into also having their children kind of go through this. And everyone was so afraid of getting smallpox that it probably wasn't too tough, except he's basically directly giving them some kind of smallpox. Typically, this was like a two-part vaccine. He would give them a little bit of it, and then he would do it again if no disease developed. Eventually, this is something that kind of got published and really started this kind of way of vaccinating people against smallpox. Later, we have Louis Pasteur creating a rabies vaccine, and he also is the one that rapidly changed our understanding in terms of germ theory is really where this came from. And I also really wanted to put in another picture of Elvis. You might notice him. There was a nationwide polio vaccine kind of drive. Some of the parents of younger children were, definitely going forward and getting their children that polio vaccine when it came out. But basically, the teenagers and the younger adults weren't as keen to get it. So they decided to call up Elvis and ask him to do, basically show some pictures and do this national kind of campaign to encourage basically his audience, people listening to his music, to also get a polio vaccine, which really helped to minimize polio and the spread of that. So one thing we just wanted to just quickly touch on, and we've kind of mentioned it throughout, was this idea of racism and epidemics. And you can kind of see that in terms of policies and also the naming of many of these different illnesses. You know, for instance, saying like the Spanish flu really possibly started in Kansas, not in Spain, or calling something the Asian flu. When I talked about the plague that was in LA in 1924, that was really blamed on the Mexican Americans and the immigrant populations because that was the hardest hit. But it was probably the hardest hit because they had, you know, the housing and things like that wasn't as good, and they were living in homes that were basically earmarked for demolition. So there was a lot of that kind of going on, and also they weren't really cleaning up those areas first. They were cleaning up those areas last in regards to trash and rats. So that moves us on to cats and rats and their connection. Random aside for this one is you may or may not know that in America, a lot of us have a superstition against black cats. And we talk about them during Halloween and things like that. Maybe they're superstitious, it's bad luck when they cross your path. But partially where that came from is Pope Gregory IX. Probably around 1232 or 1234, he issued a document called the Vox in Roma, and that basically said that a black cat is a demon or the incarnation of Satan. So they had to all be killed, black cats in particular. But for some reason, this death sentence ended up spreading to all cats, and because of that, the cat population was significantly in decline during the time right before that first plague in the 1347, basically. And because of that, perhaps this bad decision by Pope Gregory, telling everybody to be scared of black cats or that they were bad, possibly also led to the increase of the rat population and therefore the flea population. So, black cats aren't bad. So as we're wrapping up, a couple quick things. We did want to just throw in there the idea of hauntings. So if you've ever looked at a list of, you know, the top 10 most haunted places in the world or in the city or whatever, a lot of them have to do with sites maybe being creepy but not haunted, or very haunted and creepy. And so we put a couple pictures up here of some places. The one on the right is actually something we talked about before. That's Waverly Hills Sanatorium, and that was known as a tuberculosis hospital. And what you're looking at there is the body chute. At one point, they had so many people dying of TB that they were very, very overcrowded, and they ended up having a body chute to basically dump the bodies down so that they had direct access to being outside for burial quickly. The other one is basically, this is in Savannah, which some people consider, it's one of the many cities that's considered extremely haunted, but this is a brewery. And it's considered the city's most haunted location, and it began as a hotel, but at one point it was a hospital for yellow fever victims during the Civil War. So the reason why we bring this up is because we think it's kind of interesting that some of these places that are on, you know, the most haunted list or a lot of sightings have this possibility, at least a couple of them, with connections with these traumatic events. You know, hauntings are usually in places that are associated with very real and traumatizing histories, and epidemics are definitely traumatizing and very real. So there's possibly a connection with that there. So we wanted to also talk about dresses and how epidemics have, you know, lasting effects in regards to culture and how people dress. So on the far right side, we have a lady in Victorian black. Many people at this time in Victorian England were affected by a lot of people being sick from TB, so they had like funerals to go to and things like that, and so you would wear a black mourning dress. But what's also kind of interesting is it also really started this idea, maybe the precursor and the roots for Gothic style are really coming from this, because the idea would be women actually wanted to look pale and very thin, kind of mimicking what people who actually had consumption would also look like. And basically, it would kind of like drain you of the blood in your face. And so that was wanted. So they had makeup, and darker dresses would kind of give you that complexion. The other one I wanted to talk to is the plague dress, which is on the far left side. And this is a piece of art that was kind of on display in like 2018 and 2019. And it's a plague-style dress. And what's really cool about this is it's made from raw silk, hand-dyed with walnut husks. And this is in reference to a whole bunch of different things that were going on during the plague era. Yeah, the 1665 plague era. And this is, so the famous herbalist, Nicholas Culpeper, recommended walnuts as a treatment for the plague. And then the dress also has some 17th century embroideries on it that have basically the artist impregnated with DNA of the Yersinia pestis bacteria. And the artist also killed the bacteria, but it's kind of embedded within there. And then they also kind of stuffed it with bunches of lavender, which was something that was historically carried under people's noses during the Great Plague of London to cover the stench of infection and also possibly prevent disease, which was caused by miasma or bad air. So there's like a whole bunch of stuff within this dress that are like bringing a lot of those things together. And in the middle, we also have that original plague doctor mask. This one is from the 16th century. And there's a lot of different versions of this. It's also potentially a connection why sometimes we think of some birds as bad omens as well, because they kind of mimic this doctor's mask.
And what they did, the significance of the bird beak, in some countries, they would actually have herbs that were burning in them. One of the earlier pictures we show, I meant to point it out, but there's smoke coming out of one of the nose holes as the herbs slowly smoldered and was supposed to give him protection. And in other areas, it was vinegar-soaked vinegar that had been infused with herbs that was put into the beak.
So if you're curious about what you should do for Halloween 2020, there is a new fad out there that you can definitely do. Many of these things have only been sold for 2020 Halloween, but basically you can be a plague doctor too. There are actually an animatronic is in the middle where you can put this in your front yard. It kind of is supposed to mimic a plague doctor, a creepy version of it, but it actually moves, and for a little bit extra money, you can have a fog machine attached to it so that the fog can emanate from the mask and the sleeves of the doctor. You can also be a sexy plague doctor, or maybe dress up your children to be a plague doctor, which is the far right picture as an example. There's a number of different plague beaks out there. I showed 3 different ones here, but it is definitely something that you can find at many of the Halloween stores in and around San Diego and online. So maybe a new costume is in order for Halloween this year. So wrapping it up, we wanted to talk a little bit about something that we've actually talked about before, which is vampires.
Yes, and you may be wondering what connection this has with epidemics and plagues. The picture on the right, for those of you who have been coming to our Halloween talks for a long time now, our original talk was included discussions on vampires and included this photo. And interestingly enough, this same photo, this same individual has made an appearance in 3 of our talks now. The first one because the brick in her mouth was meant to be a way to prevent her from rising from the dead. And this is why researchers think that she was a vampire, and she's referred to as the Vampire of Venice. The year that we did our talk on witchcraft, she came back up again because her being a witch was another possibility for why she had been buried disrespectfully and measures taken to make sure that she didn't come back up. Well, and now she's back again for a third time. And I want to go into a bit more about the excavation that revealed her. The context in which she was buried is thought to have been, possibly where some of the myths of vampirism came about, because the process of decomposition of the body was not well understood at this time, and when you have a massive epidemic and lots of people dying, as we've already discussed, you're not doing individual interments for people, you're digging mass graves, and that means keeping some trenches open or having to reopen them, or when you dig down to open up a new area, you might accidentally uncover someone that you buried the week before. And what happens when in various stages of decay, when the human stomach decays, it releases a dark, deep red fluid that does look a lot like blood, and this liquid can seep out of the corpse's nose and the mouth. At this point, there's still intact skin on the corpse, and it's possible that when they started to reopen these burial pits, they were seeing these and thinking that these were vampires that had already risen and fed on their victims and come back into their grave to sleep, and so they would take extra precautions to try and make sure that they couldn't get back up again. It's also bricks in the mouth. Anything sort of heavy and stone-like in the mouth was an indicator that you were looking at a vampire burial. We've also seen examples where they were buried with a sickle across their neck, so if they tried to sit up, they would effectively decapitate themselves. And so these are the vampires that we have already discussed, but now they're thinking that, wondering if she was part of a big mass plague burial, and that's how she became known as a vampire or a witch.
She was found, as you can see in this picture, as part of a mass burial. But the way that she is buried with that brick, that stone in her mouth, is what makes her different and unique. Sometimes they would attribute the plague to basically vampires coming back from the dead and then infecting their victims and then spreading the virus. But what's really interesting about this particular one, and why we probably included her so many times, is that there's also evidence in terms of looking at her bones that kind of make her case a little bit more interesting. So this is an elderly female, and when you look at her bones, she would have eaten a much lower class diet, and she would have been between 61 and 70 years old at the time of death. And a person of this age is a bit rare during this time period, so she could have also been someone that was a witch due to maybe the perception that she was cheating death, by being so old. So she probably has a lot of these different markers of, was she a witch? Or, did she spread the plague? Was she a vampire? Or was she just an old lady, who happened to be also buried in this kind of general area?
It should be noted that her cause of death is actually not known, but yeah, considering that she was found in a plague pit, it is very likely that she died of the plague.
Or at least around that same time period.
Yeah. So what we have attempted to show you tonight is how epidemics from the past are still affecting our culture today, and how we learn about them, and how what we have learned about epidemics and pandemics of the past has helped shape medical industry. We didn't really get into it, but also public sanitation, public sewers, all of that stems back to plague epidemics and cholera epidemics, typhus. It's still, even though this year has really been dominated by the COVID epidemic, this is not new. Almost every aspect of our culture has formed the way it is due to the impacts, both physical and cultural, of illness and epidemics.
And with that, we have some of our sources here. This is in no way all of our sources. We just ran out of time to put them all up here. But if you would like them, just let us know, and we will maybe even put them in the show notes or something like that in regards to the YouTube video. Anything?
And that is it.
And that's it. Thank you so much. Oh, we should probably stop share.
Well, thank you very much. That was very informative. I do have a couple of questions. Let's see, April has asked, how do we know that the pit remains in China wasn't because of wars or other causes?
That's a great question. They know that they died all around the same time and that it was abandoned slightly after, but they're still working on that site and some of the sites nearby. So it's also it's by Chinese archaeologists, so we have to kind of wait a little bit in terms of like translations because I don't read Chinese. But the doctors and the archaeologists that have kind of been looking at these bones all say that it had something to do with an epidemic, something that happened quickly and that killed a huge chunk of the population.
Also, deaths by warfare are generally very violent, and you would see skeletal markers of spears going through rib cages and broken bones, and that is not...
Or some kind of trauma, basically,
yeah,
and it's not there.
It's not there.
And also, it was burned really quickly, and it was the only structure that was burned for this particular site that I brought up. So that they were trying to do something quickly and move on and not bury them. And at a time of warfare, they probably would have taken the time to bury their dead.
Are there any other questions? You can go ahead and type your question in the chat. If anyone has any more questions for Karen and Sandra.
We know that, this is a lot of little pieces of information. Each one of these slides we could have, dived into a lot deeper. There's a lot of information out there, articles that we found, as well as websites and things like that. So if you enjoyed it, definitely look at some of the sources and then also, whatever sources you put out there to kind of do your own research. I see a lot of thank yous.
Yes, there are a lot of things.
Oh, and then someone said, Demetrius says, personally, I remember the H1N1. You're right, people didn't panic as much with the H1N1. I remember there being panics, but not as much that we have today. Maybe that is related to the media, like you're saying, but I think it's also an unknown, with H1N1.
H1N1 had it targeted weaker individuals. It targeted the elderly. It targeted, I was pregnant with my first child that year, and it was scary for me because although the chances of getting it were nowhere near as high as getting COVID, it had a 27% mortality rate for pregnant women. So I think the consequences, if you had any sort of condition that would affect your immune system, were much more severe with H1N1.
Yeah, and I would also add that that's probably why we compare it to the influenza epidemic of 1918, 1919, because that one struck down healthy individuals, people who didn't have any other underlying issues or health concerns, and COVID pretty much does the same in many ways, and so that's probably why there's a connection there that we really talk about.
Last call for questions. Anyone? Anyone?
Oh, University of Iceland. Wow.
Wow.
Brandis, Brindis, if you're still on, please feel free to reach out to us through the SDCAS. MA in folk studies would be really cool, and thank you for joining us from so far away. And I see lots of messages from my son. So Marcus, if you're still online, I just saw them now, and it's past your bedtime. I'll be home soon.
So with that, I guess, happy Halloween, everyone, if you practice it. If not, happy October. Stay safe out there.
Yep.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you, guys.
Sandra.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.